Maimer from Yir Alf Nissen Tafshin Lamed Ches. We started on Monday, so we're holding chapter 2. We said the Maimer begins with a verse that when your child will ask you in the future, what are these testimonies, statutes, and laws which God, our God, has commanded you? That verse on Pesach at the Seder, we say that this verse refers to the wise son. The Torah in a few places talks about questions and answers, and so from the questions or from the answers we can tell what type of son it is, what type of child is asking the question. So this verse is the question of the wise son. We asked seemingly he's asking a question that wouldn't make him so wise. The question basically is, according to our understanding, is what's the point of the mitzvahs? First of all, he's asking, even in the Haggadah itself, it seems like, because the Haggadah's interpretation of this verse is a little different than what we're interpreting here in the literal understanding of the verse in the Torah. But either way, in the Haggadah, he doesn't know what the laws of Pesach are. So he's maybe knowledgeable, but he doesn't know that. In the Torah, he doesn't know anything about any mitzvahs, because he's asking a general question. What are all these mitzvahs? So it doesn't seem to be so wise. We explained that the question is even more troublesome when you consider that he's asking what's the point of mitzvahs, not just ignorance of what they are, but he doesn't even know why a person should do mitzvahs. Because in the answer, we tell him that the mitzvahs are good. We do the mitzvahs because God takes us out of Egypt, meaning so we're therefore beholden to Him to do the mitzvahs, to observe, to follow His commandments. And the second thing we tell him is that we benefit from doing mitzvahs. L'tov lanu kol hayamim, that it makes life better for us when we do mitzvahs. So he doesn't know either concept, or he's not familiar with it. That what's the point of doing mitzvahs? Meaning he doesn't know that mitzvahs enhance a person's life, whatever fashion, and even more troubling is that he seemingly is rejecting the whole notion of submission to God, of Kabbalah soil. That he doesn't know why should I? He's asking, why should I listen to what God wants from me? So what makes him a wise son? Certainly, like when we say wise, we mean a Torah scholar. We asked another question, which is going to be our focal point now a little bit more today. The other question, which seems to be like a sort of a technicality, is why does he say the mitzvahs that God commanded you? She'etziv Hashem Elokeinu, that our God commanded eschem you. Right, so you would think he'd be the bad son. Why? Because we know the bad son, the wicked son, asks, what is this service to you? And how do we know that he's a wicked son? Because as we read in the Haggadah, he says, Lachem v'lo eloi. He says to you and not to him. He excludes himself. And because he excludes himself, so that's how we see that he's a wicked son. So the question's asked, and this is a question asked by the commentators on the Haggadah as well, and we quoted them, the Daskenim, the Machzor Vitri, that if he's saying Eschem, when the wise son is asking, what are these mitzvahs that Hashem commands you, so seemingly he's asking in the same way as the wicked son. So in the Haggadah we answer, the commentaries on the Haggadah explain what he says, Elokeinu, since he says our God, before he says what God has commanded you, he says what our God has commanded you, meaning he accepts upon himself that it's our God. He doesn't exclude himself from the people and from the community. He's just asking about the mitzvahs. So, okay, so that's a question and answer. In chapter 1 here, that question is not the question we're asking. We're asking a different question, which is, even having said that, so that explains how we know that he's not the wicked son. But still, why does he have to say eschem? Either to say oisanu, us, what the commandments God has commanded us, or don't say anything. What are the commandments that our God has commanded? Stop. The fact that he says eschem seems to be misleading. Why does he say eschem? So he explained in the second paragraph here in chapter 1 that what the boy is asking, what the wise son is asking, is already now we can understand. It's more of a wise question, intelligent question. Hey, morning. His question is, I understand if when we do a mitzvah, we're bringing some divine energy down to this world, so I can understand why a person needs to have intent, devotion when they fulfill a mitzvah. But what's the point, the emphasis on the action? So we see there's a contrast between the observance of the mitzvahs of the patriarchs before Mount Sinai, before Hashem gives us the Torah, and then post-Sinai. And that's his question. They were accessing, when they were channeling that energy when they did a mitzvah. How did they do the mitzvah? They did the mitzvah primarily spiritually. It was tied to some kind of an act, but more of a symbolic act. It wasn't the act itself. That was the emphasis, like we brought the example from Yaakov, who was able to access and channel the energy of the mitzvah of tefillin with the sticks that he used when he was herding his sheep. Those sticks didn't become holy. They didn't become a holy thing. They remained sticks, but he tied it to an act, kind of like the analogy we gave in the last class about when a person is happy. So you're happy, you dance. Sometimes you're not happy, so in order to become happy, you dance, and dancing will make you happy. But the main thing here is the emotion, the feeling, the happiness. It's tied to an act, but the act is merely either an expression of the emotion, or it helps sort of stir that emotion within you. But the act itself is just an empty act. But now, after Mount Sinai, how does it work? When you do a mitzvah, so what happens if you have all the devotion and intention and everything, from Kabbalah, everything about every mitzvah. You meditate on the meaning of the mitzvah, the significance of the mitzvah, and you perform it spiritually in your heart. But you don't actually do the act. So then, you're left with nothing. You have no performance of a mitzvah. So you can think about matzah on the night of Pesach, sit and think about matzah, meditate on matzah and everything you know about matzah, but if you don't actually eat matzah, so it's not that you've achieved some form of the mitzvah, you're just missing a little bit. You're missing a part of it. You're missing 100% of the mitzvah. So we see that the act is the entirety of the mitzvah. And the reverse, when you eat matzah without thinking about it, in fact, matzah is a good example, we quoted in the footnote, that matzah, you don't even need any intention. You don't even have to have the intention of fulfilling the mitzvah. You just happen to be munching on crackers on the night of Pesach, and the cracker happens to be a matzah. You fulfilled the mitzvah without any intention. So we see that it's the physical act that's the most important. So that's his question. He says, I don't understand. If we're talking about the connection, the relationship between us and God, so I can understand the way the patriarchs perform the mitzvahs in a spiritual sense. But what does it mean that now, after Mount Sinai, we perform the mitzvah? The main thing is the act. How is the act the vehicle through which we draw that energy? That's his question. So therefore he says, Eschem, you, meaning you post Mount Sinai. You as opposed to the patriarchs before. Okay, so that's what we explained in chapter 1. Now let's go chapter 2. So for Lahavin, we have to understand the L'chaira, Biur Hanal, Shailas Haben Chacham Hi, Al HaMitzvah Shel Achri Matan Torah Dafka. So we need to understand, when the son, now that we explained what's his question is, our initial question was, why does he say Eschem, you, seemingly excluding himself? So we explained because he's trying to highlight the difference between pre-Mount Sinai and post-Mount Sinai. So he's telling the child is asking his parents, what is this that God has commanded you, meaning now after Mount Sinai? So if that's the case, if that's what he wanted to say, so then that only answers part of the question. We ask the question, we say you can ask in two ways. Why does he say Eschem, you, and not Oisanu, us? Or why does he say anything at all? Don't say anything. Just say what are these mitzvahs that God has commanded. Period. When we say now, according to our understanding, our explanation, that he's asking about the difference between pre and post Mount Sinai, so I understand why he can't say nothing. The verse has to say something. The verse can't say, what are the mitzvahs that God has commanded? Because he's asking the mitzvahs that God has commanded now, as opposed to earlier. So he has to add something to the sentence, to the question. So that answers only that part of the question, but it doesn't answer the other part, which is, even if he wanted to ask about the difference between the mitzvahs pre and post Mount Sinai, he could have still said, Oisanu, us. Why is he saying, Eschem, you? Right? So this thing is bir rak al zeh shel achrei shoemer asher tziva vayelekenu hu moisef eschem b'chtei lahadgish shaylase ilay al mitzvahs da'avis ke'im al mitzvahs asher tziva vayelekenu eschem la'achrei matan Torah. This explanation only addresses why we had to add a word at the end of that sentence, in the end of the verse. Why does it say you can't just stop asher tziva vayelekenu? He has to say something else. But he still could have. But still he could have said. This would have been the same. We could have understood it the same way and interpreted it the same way if he said Oisanu, which is more inclusive. So why does he say Eschem? So it doesn't really answer the full question, just part of it. Okay, now we're going to ask a few more questions. Another question is like this. According to what we said, his question is, what's the emphasis on the action? Right? He's asking, what's the difference between pre and post Matan Torah, pre and post Sinai? So the question is, what's the emphasis on action? action, the emphasis on action is equal in all mitzvahs. All mitzvahs, the emphasis is the act. That's where the emphasis is. And yet, that's not how he asks the question. So we have to understand, Oimra, he says, Maha edus v'achukim v'mishpatim. What are these testimonies, statutes, and laws? If his question is about the emphasis on the action in mitzvahs, so then he should have just said, what are the mitzvahs? So he could have been more inclusive both in who he's addressing the question, how he's addressing the question, say that God has commanded us, and furthermore, he could have been more inclusive in just why is he getting into details? Say, what are the mitzvahs that God has commanded us? Or befrat, but so the question is not just a technicality in the language, but this question, the way he actually words the question, seemingly undermines his question. How so? So befrat shachiluk dasugum the edus chukum mishpatim hu bekavonas hamitzvos. Shat mitzvos the chukum tzarich lekayim b'nei shem b'tziv hakadosh baruch hu gzeir gezarti v'amitzvos the edus mishpatim tzarich lekayim gam mitzad hatam. We said, what's he asking here? He's asking, what's the emphasis on the action? So in mitzvahs, as we'll get into soon, there are two general components. There's the act of the mitzvah, and then there's the intention in the mitzvah, the reason for each specific mitzvah. So we said he has no problem with the intention in the mitzvah, with the kavanah of a mitzvah. His problem is the emphasis on the act. How is the act what the main thing? So when we divide the mitzvahs into categories of edus, chukim, mishpatim, what's the difference between them? We'll read inside in a moment. The difference is in terms of the intention, what type of mitzvah it is. But if his question is about the act, there all the mitzvahs are the same. So every mitzvah is the same when it comes to the bottom line act of this is what God wants, and that's what we fulfill. That is expressed in the action. But that each mitzvah has a certain reason and a motivation and a certain intention, that's already dealing with that realm, the realm of intention of the mitzvah, not the realm of the act. So if his whole problem is the action, so then he's better off asking what are the mitzvahs in a general term, because that's his concern. In note 18, he says, with the idea that even mitzvahs that we don't have a reason for, that the idea that mitzvahs, sorry, I jumped in. He says inside the mitzvahs of edus chukim mishpatim, you have to fulfill them even because of the reason. Once we divide mitzvahs into separate categories, it means there's also motivation for them, as he says in note 18, which is shalachin nekroim b'torah b'shem edus mishpatim. That's why the mitzvahs of edus mishpatim, why are they called edus mishpatim? Because there's a reason for them, meaning that when you perform the mitzvah, that's also partly because of the reason, the rationale behind the mitzvah. So we see the point is that when we're getting into the different categories of mitzvahs, there's a rationale, there's a reasoning, there's an intention. That seems to undermine his question. I mean, it doesn't answer his question, but his question is not as forceful because he's confusing two different topics. Okay, so he should say maha mitzvahs, and the question is not just a technicality. The question is, it would make his question more forceful if he just focuses on that commonality of the mitzvah, the main thing of the action. Gam tzarich lahavin. We also have to understand sheshaylas haben hi al kol gimel hasugim the mitzvahs edus chukim mishpatim. His question is on all three categories, right? That's what he's asking. Why edus chukim mishpatim? Uba atshuva. And in the answer that he's given in the Torah, what's the verse say? Vaytzavenu gomer lasis is called chukim gomer maskir chukim. What is the answer to the child's question? That God commanded us to perform these chukim, these statutes. That's only one of the three. So why does he not mention that he commanded us to perform the edus, the chukim, and the mishpatim? Why just chukim? Okay. Gam tzarich lavin, we also have to understand. The achiluk b'gimel hasugim edus chukim mishpatim hu shemishpatim hema mitzvah shemechiyav mitzad haseichel k'may gezel geneva kibudavei. The difference between these three categories of mitzvahs, edus, chukim, and mishpatim, is that mishpatim are mitzvahs that are logical mitzvahs, that would be expected of us rationally. For example, the mitzvah of robbery, of theft, and of honoring your parents. Those are three examples of mitzvahs that are rational mitzvahs, that a person should come to rationally on their own. The edus, ema mitzvahs shem ois v'zikaron, what are edus testimonies? Those are mitzvahs that are signs and testimonies. K'may Shabbos, Pesach, Sukkah, Tefillin. For example, Shabbos, Pesach, Sukkah, and Tefillin. These are mitzvahs that are all signs, meaning that the mitzvahs elu, these mitzvahs agam shaseichel mitzadatzmei lulei tzivat Torah loy hoyim achayvam. These are mitzvahs. This is a category of mitzvahs that one would not come to on their own rationally to perform any of these mitzvahs. had the Torah not commanded us. And this is unlike the first category we mentioned of mishpatim, which is the rational mitzvahs, whereas the Gemara says that were the Torah not given, we still would learn these laws from the animal kingdom. You'd learn tznius, modesty, you'd learn from a cat, and you'd learn honesty in terms of robbery from ants. We'd be able to learn from the world around you how to behave. But nevertheless, Eidos, on the other hand, we wouldn't be able to learn from anything. We only have these mitzvahs because God commanded us to perform them. Nevertheless, once the Torah commands us, our intellect agrees with these mitzvahs. Meaning, Hashem says, I created the world in 6 days, I rested on the seventh, and therefore, in order to bear witness to this thing, I want you to keep Shabbos. Okay, so on our own, we wouldn't think to keep Shabbos, but once Hashem says that I wanted to bear witness to X, Y, or Z, so then it makes sense. Tefillin, the idea of subjugating the mind and the heart to God, so that, once He commands us, that makes sense, this idea of subjugating the mind and heart to God. And so to all the holidays that commemorate a historic event and a kindness that God performed for us, we can understand why we should perform them. So on our own, we wouldn't think to do these things. But once Hashem commands us, we understand it. It makes sense to us. The chukim, what about chukim? We're calling statutes. These are mitzvahs that even after God commands us to perform them, they have no place in our logical minds. The Medrash says that it's a form of chukah chakakti. I've established my statutes, and gzeir gezarti, I've decreed my decrees, and that's it. There's an ein l'cha rishus lahar. Don't start thinking about those things. Don't start analyzing them. This is how it is. I'm laying it down. This is how it is, and don't ask about it. Don't try to understand it. Or it's an extreme interpretation of this. We're going to see eventually that actually we do have to endeavor to understand a little bit, but that's not for now. Point is that chukim, that category is mitzvahs, all the laws, for instance, of purity, tumantara, kosher, all of those laws are laws that are not rational, and even after God instructs us to perform them, they still have no place in our minds, no logical explanation to them. Okay, so this is all an introduction for the next question, which is, mishpatim edus v'chukim. So now the question, based on this understanding, that mishpatim are mitzvahs that are rational, that we would know even had God not commanded us to perform them. But rationally we would come to perform them. Edus are mitzvahs that are rational only after God tells them to us, then they make sense to us. And chukim are mitzvahs that are totally irrational or beyond our comprehension even after God commands them. So then, what would be the order if you wanted to list these three categories of mitzvahs in an order? Either from the lowest to the highest, meaning or ones that are more rational to less rational, or the ones that are not rational to rational. How would you list them? You'd list either mishpatim, edus, chukim, right? The most rational, mishpatim, less or also rational, but only after God commands us, edus, and then chukim. Or if you wanted to go the other way, chukim, edus, mishpatim. That's how you would list them in a nice sequence. And yet, our verse doesn't do that. So, the verse should have listed them. The question should be, what are the mishpatim, the edus, and the chukim? Or it could have asked in the reverse. Chukim, edus, and mishpatim. It could have gone from above to below, meaning from the non-rational to the rational. Chukim, edus, and mishpatim. Because of edus, chukim, mishpatim. But the order, the verse, seems to be without any sequence. Edus, and then chukim, and then mishpatim. It doesn't seem to follow any kind of an order. That's a technicality, but these last few questions that are sort of technical questions will all be understood in the end when we understand really what's going on here. Okay, but the point is that until now, what we're working with here is that the question of the wise son is what's the difference? Why is it that we have this emphasis on the action in the mitzvah? That's his question. Why is it that I understand how the patriarch served God and performed mitzvahs spiritually. But what is this with the service of God and the emphasis being on the action itself? That's his question. Right? And then we ask all these questions based on, if that's the question, so we have all these problems. Now let's move on to chapter 3. So the Rebbe is going to introduce the question that we asked. The one that we've been focusing mainly on is about the word eschem. So we said there's a question that the commentaries ask, eschem, it sounds like the wicked son. It sounds like an exclusionary question. So we said, no, that's not the question, as the commentaries or God, meaning he is including himself. So the question is just eschem. Okay, so we were left with the problem. Still, why do you have to use still such a problematic term? Anyway, he could have done something better. Okay, but we weren't concerned with that question that we might think that the wise son sounds like the wicked son. But the Rebbe is going to quote from the Maimer of the Frierdiker Rebbe, where the previous Rebbe says that we could make that mistake. And that'll help us start to get into the explanation. Okay, so chapter 3. The Yuvan Zebahaktim, Mashakos, in the question of the wise son, he says, Eschem, you, the Bezeshemer, Eschem, V'lo the fact that he says you and not us, who la ben Rasha. So already the previous Rebbe is asking that question, not the question that we said we weren't asking, but that's the question he does ask. Why does he say Eschem, you, which seemingly puts him in the same category, in the same camp as the wicked son, who is excluding himself? So it does say that the word Eschem does imply this. And he continues in his Maimer. In other words, why is it that we would think that he's like the Ben Rasha? Why can't you say? He says Elokeinu. Like, why is that answer not satisfactory, the answer that we had given from the commentary? So he says like this. Even though the wise son does say Elokeinu, which is like that we said the answer from the Daskenim, the answer from Machzaviti, that he's including himself, meaning when he says our God, meaning he's including himself among the Jewish people, counting himself among them, and even including himself in being subservient to God, serving God. If he's my God, then I have to serve him. So, however, that's only, when does he include himself? Only when we're talking about the main fundamental concept. But when it comes to the details, here he says Eschem, here he excludes himself, meaning that it's only a partial acceptance, it's a partial inclusion. Right? So first we said, he says Eschem, how do we know that he's not excluding himself? Because he says Elokeinu. But the Frierdiker Rebbe explains that really his question, there are two parts here. There are two things. There's being subservient to God, fulfilling God's will obediently, and then there is the rational or the details of every single mitzvah and serving God in that capacity. So when the wise son says Elokeinu, he's saying Elokeinu if that's for one part of it. But when he's saying Eschem, he's actually excluding himself. He is excluding himself. And that's why we think he's like the wicked son. Let's see what he says. When the Frierdiker Rebbe explains in his Maimer that the problem with the word Eschem, where he's excluding himself, it's not just like we're asking, why does he say Eschem? Use a better word, say Sanu. So he's not just asking, why is he saying Eschem, seemingly that it didn't need to say, but the point is, by saying Eschem, he's actually acting like the Rasha. He is excluding himself. He's only agreeing to include himself in the aspect of serving God obediently. When it comes to the details, there he already objects. That's where he's objecting, and he's excluding himself. What does this mean? So there explains. What is the meaning here in the question? What does it mean that he's including himself for serving Hashem and obediently, but not when it comes to the breakdown of Eidos Chukim Mishpatim? What does this mean? So there are two components, two facets to each mitzvah. Number one is that mitzvahs are God's commandment, God's will. The inyan zeh hu b'chol mitzvahs, this is equal in all mitzvahs. And then the other component, which is that mitzvahs are divided into these three categories of Eidos Chukim and Mishpatim. So this is the idea in general mitzvahs. The mitzvah is a mitzvah. Mitzvah means a commandment. And all mitzvahs are called mitzvahs. Every one of the 630 commandments are called mitzvahs. So why are they all called by the same name? Because they all are the same, have the same idea. The commonality between them is that they're all God's commandments. But mitzvahs are also divided into three categories. Find in the Torah, like in this verse, and other places, that they're called either Eidos Chukim Mishpatim. So meaning that the mitzvahs themselves are both, on one hand, all the same. They have the same name because they're all the same. They're all God's commands. But also they're different. There are rational mitzvahs, there are irrational, super rational mitzvahs, right? There are testimonies. So there are different categories of the mitzvahs. And that's not only true with regard to mitzvahs, but that's true even in the performance. This is true even in the observance of the mitzvahs. That we find two aspects to the intention with which one performs a mitzvah. There's the kavana klalis, l'kayim tzivei Hashem. There's the general intent, which is equal in all mitzvahs, which is whenever you're about to perform a mitzvah, you have the intention of fulfilling God's will. The kavana zuhi b'chol mitzvahs z'shaveh. This is equal in all mitzvahs. The kavana pratis, then there's the specific intention of the mitzvahs, which is kiyum ha-mitzvah mipnei shehi edus ois v'zikaron alei ze'inyin. That is to perform the mitzvah, depending whichever mitzvah. If it's an edus, it's a testimony, so you're performing the mitzvah because it testifies to something. Or because the mitzvah is a super rational, a non-rational mitzvah, or because the mitzvahs are mandated even because of one's intellect. So, so this is then the question of the wise son. Since all mitzvahs are God's will, God's commandments, why is it necessary for this breakdown into divisions of Eidus, Chukim, and Mishpatim? So Falachim Edaik Ba Maimer, the Gam Lachar Shomer Lekeinu, Yashmokim Litais Shrebenegeh, Leprote Yanyanim, the Eidus Chukim Mishpatim, and Maitzi Chas Shomas Hatzmi Me'aklal. So this is then the meaning in the previous Rebbe's Maimer, where he explains that when he says Eschem, it would seem that he's like the wicked son, that he's excluding himself, because there are two components to mitzvahs. And when it comes to the second component, he seems to be rejecting it, not including himself. And that's why, to prevent us from coming to that conclusion about him, that he's excluding himself, like the wicked son, he should have said Eisanu. So we know that he's not really excluding himself. That we know because he said Elokeinu, he's including himself. But since there's room to suggest that he's excluding himself with regard to one component of the mitzvahs, he should have said Eisanu. So this question now of Eisanu is bigger than the one we asked before chapter 3. Before chapter 3 we said Eisanu still makes more sense than Eschem. But we weren't so bothered by the Eschem. Because the premise was that he's not really excluding himself. So he's not really excluding himself, so why does he have to specifically use an exclusionary term and not another? But we were never really in doubt as to whether he was including himself or not. We didn't think he was excluding. He said, Elokeinu, our God. But the way the Friedrich Rebbe explains it, and he explains that there are two components to the mitzvahs. There's the general intent of a mitzvah, which is to fulfill God's will. That's equal in all mitzvahs. Then there's the individual categories within the mitzvahs, which is the rational, the irrational, the super-rational, the testimonies. And that's his question when he's asking, because remember we asked, why does he say Maha mitzvahs? What are the mitzvahs? So based on the previous Rebbe's explanation, because he's not asking what are the mitzvahs. He gets this idea that all mitzvahs are God's commandments and therefore you have to fulfill them obediently. His question is specifically, what are the categories, the breakdown of the mitzvahs, the specific intention in the mitzvahs, why do I have to be involved in that? And since you can divide the mitzvahs into these two components, so now when he says, he says, Elokeinu, our God, because he's going to serve him obediently. But then what is he asking? What are the Eidus Chukim Mishpatim that he gave you? Why are you performing? That's what it seems like he's asking. Really, he just wants an explanation. He really just wants to know what's the point of having this breakdown. But since there are two components, you could think when he says Eschem, that he's actually excluding himself. And so therefore that strengthens that question. It's a deeper question now, a stronger question, as to why I use the term Eschem and not Eisanu. It's not just a linguistic question. It's a question in meaning of what's going on.
The question is, why aren't you just doing it for the main covenant mitzvahs? Why
the general idea, yeah. To be obedient to serve Hashem. Let's take a look at the footnotes here a second. So this idea, it's interesting. The Gemara says that the 248 positive commandments correspond to the 248 limbs, right? The Zohar says that Ramach Pikudin Inun Ramach Ivarin de Malka, that the 248 mitzvahs, the positive commandments, are the 248 limbs, so to speak, of God, of the King, of God. And the two really are linked. The Gemara is just saying, seemingly, of man. That man has 248 limbs that correspond to the 248 commandments, really. But really, they're really linked. Why does man have 248 limbs? Or why do we have 248? Because that's how it is, so to speak, by God. So what's this meaning that we have so many mitzvahs and details and that they correspond to the different limbs? Because each mitzvah has its own function. Every mitzvah has a specific function, just like every limb has a specific function. You have eyes to see and ears to hear, etc. So the same idea is each mitzvah has a specific function. And that's why we have the 613. But on the other hand, even though each mitzvah has its specific function, its specific connection to whatever part of the body that it engages when we perform it, but there's also the general idea, the commonality of all of them, which is that God's will. So inside we said that mitzvahs you have two things. Let's look at note 24. Re'ele kamon Chelik Daled Am Tesvav. So in another Maimer, the Rebbe says like this: when a person does the mitzvah, you have to have two intentions when you're performing the mitzvah. Kavana klalis l'kaim ratzon Hashem. Number one is the intention which is common in all of them, which is to fulfill God's will. The kavana pratis, and a specific intention hashayeches lo'isa mitzvah. So you have to have the intention, the general intention. I'm now going to fulfill God's will. That's equal in all mitzvahs. Doesn't matter what mitzvah it is. But then there's a specific intention for the specific mitzvah because it has its own specific function. So we see that there are two components to all the mitzvahs. Note 25. It would seem we can understand how, let's say, mishpatim and edus are mitzvahs that have these two components. You fulfill. There's when you're going to honor your parents. So you're let's say doing a specific act of honoring your parents. So before you have this in mind, or when you're engaging in the mitzvah, you have in mind God commands me to honor my parents. I'm fulfilling God's will to honor my parents. But then there's also the specific detail of that I'm in honoring your parents, which makes sense, which is rational, the reasoning behind it, and so on. When you're going to keep Shabbos, you say, I'm keeping Shabbos because God commands me to keep Shabbos. But also, I'm bearing witness to God's creating the world in 6 days, resting on the seventh. But what about chukim? Chukim, we said, have no reason. They're not understood. So when you perform a mitzvah, a mitzvah that you don't understand, the non-rational mitzvahs, where are the two components here? What is the individual intent? You don't understand it. What's the individual intention in that mitzvah? So Rebbe explains, note 25. He says like this: the Bechukim, the Kamonsham, in that other Maimer, I think it's Havayli Ba'izri, the Rebbe says, the Bechukim mudgeshes kavana haklalis l'kaim ratzon Hashem. In Chukim, primarily, what do we see? Why does a person fulfill these mitzvahs? Because you're fulfilling God's will, doing what God wants. There's also a specific function in the chukim, which is not just the general idea that's equal in all mitzvahs, that you're fulfilling God's will, but that when a person engages in mitzvahs, performs a mitzvah that he doesn't understand, what does that do? That humbles him. It's a humbling experience. We're rational, intelligent people. I'm sorry?
Humble is a mitzvah?
No, it has a specific effect. It has a specific effect on you. It has a humbling effect. In other words, there's a detail to the mitzvah as well. There's a specific intention to that mitzvah as well. Even the fact that you don't understand it means that it's humbling. Regam say it's even more so from Tzemach Tzedek, the fact that when a person performs the chukim, the irrational, the non-rational mitzvahs, he has to do it in a way that he's fulfilling God's decree without any reason. What's the reason to perform a mitzvah like that? That's in order to break the unholiness. So it turns out that even in chukim we have more than just the general idea of being obedient, of serving God, fulfilling His will. There's also a specific intention. In addition to the general intention of fulfilling God's will, which is bittul v'skafia. That when we perform a mitzvah that we don't understand, that causes us to be humbled, and it causes us to break the arrogance of the unholiness, of the ungodliness. Of our own personal arrogance. So we're breaking the other side by doing that. So we see that there's even a specific intention, even in the non-rational mitzvahs. Okay. Can we start chapter 4? No? Okay, so we'll continue Mitzvah Shem in the next class, chapter 4.